Dollar. Dirt and money, no soul. Had to go and get it, ain't no time to kick it. Got a stack and flip for my foes. Dollar. Please tell me you can hear me. Don't turn your back and don't neglect me. Just let me know if you need me. Dollar. Let me watch out for my partners. Keep my money long, get my team strong. Let me run away from my problems.
Yep, what's good, original crew, man? We're back. Hey, we're back on the channel. We got a new Mr. Ballin'. Today's video, we got gas station footage solved this playboy's murder. Ooh. Hey, with that being said, let's go. Let's check this out. Let's see what's about. You ready, Cee?
Already.
Come on, Cee.
One early morning in...
Oh, sorry.
Dang. I forgot.
One early morning in April of 2012, a man was walking through the woods in coastal France. He lived nearby and he had just seen a column of smoke coming out of the trees in this area. And so he was just coming out here to make sure there was not a brush fire or something. And so he walked through the woods and eventually he reached the source of the smoke. It was in this clearing, and right away he felt relieved because what he saw was just the remains of a bonfire. And it was just smoldering, and now there was just some smoke coming up off of it. He was about to turn around and go maybe get some water and douse it out completely, but he smelled something. Like it was a weird smell that clearly was coming from the fire. And so curious, there's nobody else around, he just began walking to the fire to see what was making this smell. And as he got close enough, he realized there was something in that fire. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the like button a nice fresh burrito. But don't tell them, instead of using ground beef, you used cat food. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the night of April 26, 2012, a 39-year-old bouncer named Lionel Veronese opened the door of a nightclub in Chambéry, France, and he let a woman inside. And as this woman came in, she stopped and made a point to look at Lionel and smile at him and thank him by name. So Chambéry was a small city up in the Alps, and Lionel, the bouncer, was a fixture in its nightlife scene. Pretty much everybody in town who went out to the bars and clubs had either seen Lionel standing at the door outside or partying inside when he was not on the clock. And it was not just the locals who knew who this guy was. Lionel was also well known among the rich and famous tourists who often vacationed in Chambéry, and even sometimes he would pick up side work as a bodyguard for these rich and famous people. And for Lionel, his career as sort of this fixture in the nightlife scene was fun and pretty glamorous at times. But it also could be dangerous. In fact, just a few months ago, he got into this huge fist fight protecting one of his clients, and in fact, he actually got arrested for it. But tonight, Lionel was just trying to get through a shift without any trouble. There was this long line of people who were waiting outside the club, waiting to get in, and Lionel checked their IDs one by one and let them in. And then finally, when the line started to clear, Lionel saw a familiar face walking toward him. It was his good friend, Mike Boof, who Lionel often went drinking with multiple times a week. And at first, Lionel was just really glad to see Mike. But as Mike got closer, Lionel realized that Mike actually looked really mad. And so by the time Mike actually reached Lionel just said to him hey, what's going on? You look pretty upset. And Mike would tell him that he had just been at his friend Philippe's house, and Philippe had told him that seemed really, really weird. So Philippe Perrier, Mike's friend, the guy whose house he just came from, was extremely wealthy because his family ran this world-famous winery near Chambéry. Now, Lionel had never actually met Philippe himself, but he knew of him. His family was incredibly well-connected in town because they're so rich and they had this winery. And Mike was friends with him and often talked about him. And so now Mike explained to Lionel what this really weird thing was that he heard when he was visiting with Philippe. So apparently, Philippe's house had been robbed the day before, and Philippe believed Lionel, the bouncer, was the one who had done it. Now, Lionel immediately acted totally taken aback and began to ask Philippe, why in the world would he even think that? But Mike, his buddy here, just cut him off, and he's like, Lionel, don't play dumb. Like, Philippe knows you're sleeping with his wife, Natalie. And Natalie is actually the one who's blaming you for this robbery. Now, at this, Lionel went from this sort of shock and awe reaction to actually just feeling really nervous. He actually began to sweat because, he knew it was true. He had slept with Natalie. He'd met her at a club one night a couple of months ago, and they'd hooked up in the coat check room. But Lionel realistically had a lot of flings with a lot of different women. And he'd actually pretty much completely forgotten about hooking up with Natalie, since it had just been like a casual thing and he hadn't seen her in weeks. And so he had no idea why now, suddenly, she would be accusing him of theft. Like, it doesn't really make any sense to him. So Lionel, he was genuinely stunned. He knew what he had done. He had slept with Natalie, and that's problematic. But he told Mike very truthfully that he did not break into Philippe's house. Like, there was nothing going on between he and Natalie. That was just a fling. It was nothing. Like, I really didn't do this. But Mike, despite, being friends with Lionel and knowing him quite well, did not appear to believe him. He just sort of narrowed his eyes and nodded and said, "Okay, I'll pass that along to Philippe." 3 days later, on the night of April 29th, Lionel sat in a chair in his living room in Chambéry, finishing up a phone call. So he lived in a small apartment with his mother and also his nephew, Julien. However, Julien was just 4 years younger than him, so in many ways they were more like brothers. And so as soon as Lionel hung up the phone, Julien, who was sitting in the room with him on the other side on the couch watching TV, he immediately asked Lionel, "Who were you talking to?" Lionel got up and he walked over and sat down next to Julien on the couch. And then he said to him, "Oh, that was my friend Mike. And he had just called to see if I wanted to go out tonight for a drink." And so Julien's like, "Okay, cool." And then there's a little bit of silence. And then Lionel was like, "Actually, I want to tell you something." And then he filled in Julien on the weird conversation he had had with Mike just a few days before, where basically Mike was saying that, Lionel was being accused of robbing this rich guy's home, Philippe's home. And so Julien, when he heard this, he was sort of like, this seems like a big deal. But Lionel, despite being the one to bring it up and being the one to indicate this could be a big deal, he quickly downplayed it when he saw the reaction and was just like, it is what it is. I didn't do it. And, me and Mike were back on good terms. This whole thing was just, a misunderstanding. Everything is back to normal now. Just a weird thing that happened. And so Lionel and Julien, they shifted the conversation and chatted about whatever for the next couple of minutes. And then Lionel's phone buzzed. And at the same time, he saw there were headlights pulling up outside. So Lionel grabbed his jacket and he told Julien he'd be back in a few hours. Then he went out the door. 2 days later, on the evening of May 1st, 2012, Lionel's nephew, Julien, walked into the Chambéry police station. He had spent the past 2 days very worried and stressed because Lionel had not come home after hanging out with Mike that night, and he now was not answering his phone. And Lionel was never gone for this long without giving Julien or his mother a heads up. Julien had tried to convince himself that he was just overreacting to this whole thing and that Lionel could take care of himself. He was an adult. He was a tough adult, he could handle himself. However, when he found out that Lionel also hadn't been at work for the past couple of days, Julien knew something was wrong. So Julien, after getting inside the station, he walked right up to the front desk and told them, "I need to report somebody missing." The following afternoon, so May 2nd, 2012, Captain Florent Mazarin walked into an interrogation room at the Chambéry police station. He was leading the investigation into Lionel's missing person case, and sitting inside of the interrogation room at the table was, so far, the only suspect they had in this case, Lionel's friend, Mike Boof, who he had gone out with on the night he had disappeared. So it had only been a few days since anyone had seen Lionel, but Mazarin was already sure that there was foul play involved. Chambéry was a small town, and a lot of the officers on the police force there knew Lionel, and a couple of them were pretty much adamant that Lionel was just not the kind of person who would just leave town with no warning. Julien, Lionel's nephew, had said the exact same thing when he reported Lionel missing. He also was the one who told police that the last person Lionel was with was Mike on the night he went missing. And Mike also, they found out, had recently accused Lionel of robbing someone's house. So Mazarin was really eager to get in there and hear what Mike had to say. So into the room he went. He sat down across from Mike, who seemed calm, but also definitely curious, like he wasn't sure even why he was there. And when Mazarin started in by asking him about the robbery that supposedly Lionel was involved in, Mike just nodded and explained that the break-in had happened about a week earlier at the home of his good friend, Philippe Perrier. And when Mazarin heard that name, he sort of raised an eyebrow, because like basically everybody else in Chambéry, Mazarin knew who the Perriers were. And he was surprised that someone so rich and so powerful would be running in the same circles as, sort of traditional working class men like Mike and like Lionel. However, before he could dive in and ask some basic follow-up questions about how he knows the Perriers, Mike went on to say that he ran an electrician business and he had a warehouse that was right next to Philippe's winery. So they saw each other all the time. And he said that Philippe knew Mike was friends with Lionel, and so after this break-in and robbery happened, he had asked Mike to talk to Lionel about it because he was suspicious that he had done it. But Mike said when he actually confronted Lionel just a few days ago and brought up the break-in, that Lionel had sworn he didn't know anything about it. And Mike had passed that on to Philippe, and as far as he knew, that had been the end of it. Like they were not going to continue to assume that Lionel had anything to do with it. Now, Mike was being so earnest as he told the story that Mazarin thought there was a good chance he was simply telling the truth here, and that this robbery thing was really just a big misunderstanding. However, when Mazarin asked Mike where he had been on Sunday night, when Lionel was last seen, presumably with Mike, Mike's whole demeanor changed. He began to visibly shift in his seat and began looking down at the table instead of eye contact with Mazarin, and then he just said that he had been home all night with his girlfriend. He did say at a certain point he had called Lionel to try to make plans with him for that night, but they'd never actually met up and they didn't see each other. Now, at this point, Mazarin was pretty confident that Mike was lying. Not just because of Mike's very obvious change in body language, but Lionel's nephew had sworn he had seen Mike's car outside their building on that night that Mike is saying he did not meet up with Lionel. Now, it was possible that Julien had been mistaken, but if Mike was lying to the police about having been with Lionel on the night he disappeared, well, that made Mike seem very, very suspicious.
Or because somebody had got Mike's car to use it to lure him.
But either way it go,
Mike
earlier in the day called him to make plans, so he spoke with him, and he got a call right before he went down.
But I'm still saying like the luring part.
Yeah, possibly.
So you still know.
Or someone made him or got him to do it or whatever.
That's what I'm saying. So you have knowledge of it in some shape.
And so Mazarin just put Mike on the spot and said, okay, give me your girlfriend's name and her contact information so I can confirm your alibi. And so he did. He handed it over. And then Mazarin got up, left the interrogation room, and went to go give her a call. On the evening of May 2nd, 2012, so just a few hours after questioning Mike Bouffe about Lionel's disappearance, Captain Mazarin drove up to a big house in a quiet, wealthy suburb just outside of Chambéry, France. Now, by this point, he had already spoken to Mike's girlfriend, who had confirmed what Mazarin was already thinking, which was Mike was lying about spending the whole night of Lionel's disappearance at home with her. In fact, she said that Mike hadn't been home at all. She said she had been at home by herself all night. She had watched a movie, and then at some point she had fallen asleep, maybe around midnight. And at that point, when she fell asleep, Mike still was not back from wherever he was. So right now, Mike was not only their sole suspect, but he was also their best suspect. Mazarin knew that a few days before Lionel's disappearance, Mike had confronted Lionel about this supposed robbery at Philippe Perrier's house. And so now Mazarin was at Philippe's house to see what he had to say about the whole situation. And so Mazarin pulled his car up in front of the house, he parked, he got out, he walked up to the front door, and he rang the doorbell. And a moment later, Philippe himself opened the door. And he seemed genuinely surprised to see Mazarin standing there. And so he quickly asked Mazarin if he was here to follow up on the robbery investigation. And Mazarin said, sort of. Mazarin said for now, he just wanted to know if he could come inside and they could chat. And for a moment, it seemed, at least to Mazarin, that Philippe sort of hesitated, like he didn't necessarily want to do that. But then he sort of relaxed and nodded and said, sure. And he let Mazarin inside. And so Mazarin, he stepped inside of this beautiful house that was very well furnished, and he was led to the living room. And Mazarin took a seat, and then after Philippe sat down as well, he asked Philippe to walk him through what had happened with this supposed robbery. Philippe explained that his wife Natalie had come home one afternoon, and when she had come into the living room, she saw one of the windows had been shattered. And then Mazarin said that, after seeing this, they searched the house and they eventually went downstairs to the basement where their safe was, and they found their safe had been broken into as well, and a lot of cash that had been in there was gone. Philippe said he had called the police about it and they'd come out to investigate, but so far he hadn't heard anything. And so Mazarin, after hearing this, asked Philippe if he thought he knew who was responsible. And Philippe immediately nodded and said yes. Then he repeated what Mike Booth had said. It was Lionel Veronese. And the reason he knew that was Lionel was having an affair with his wife Natalie, and Natalie said it was Lionel. Mazarin looked really hard at Philippe because this was huge. If Philippe knew that Lionel was having an affair with his wife, that gave him, Philippe, plenty of motive to want Lionel dead. And as of right now, Lionel was gone and no one knew what happened to him, so maybe he was murdered. And so, operating on a hunch, Mazarin followed up by asking Philippe if he had any weapons in the house. And to his surprise, Philippe said yes. And so Mazarin asked if he could see them. And so Philippe got up and led him over to the stairs that went down to the basement. And when they got down there was this huge gun safe with a few plastic firearm cases stacked around it. And so Philippe, once they got down there, he sort of stepped out of the way so that Mazarin could look around. And almost as soon as he did begin walking around Mazarin and began opening up these cases, he discovered that one of those cases, which had space for 2 weapons in it, was empty. And so Mazarin asked Philippe, hey, where are the 2 guns that go in this case? And Philippe said, actually, those were stolen during the robbery. However, after hearing this, and as Mazarin is staring at this empty gun case, something just was not adding up. Philippe clearly had a motive to want to hurt Lionel, because he was having an affair with his wife.
Right.
And he happened to have 2 missing guns. Now, of course, at this point, Mazarin did not know if Lionel was definitely, dead, and therefore couldn't know if he had been shot or not. But still, this was really suspicious. But at the same time, Philippe was from this very wealthy and highly respected family. He didn't really seem like the kind of person who would go around murdering or kidnapping people in revenge. And if he had, let's say, done something bad to Lionel, it was just odd that he would just so readily admit to clearly having a motive to harm Lionel and to show the detective a basement full of weapons, including a gun case that was missing weapons. And so basically, until Mazarin was able to figure out what actually happened to Lionel, until that time, he would have a really hard time proving that Philippe had anything to do with it. The next morning, Captain Mazarin was in his office at the police station, going over the notes from his interview with Philippe to see if there was anything he missed. At this point, Mazarin's theory was that either Mike or Philippe, or maybe even both of them, had gone to confront Lionel about the affair and about the robbery, and then things had turned violent. But just then, there was a knock on his door, and Mazarin turned and he saw his door was open, and there was this woman standing there, and her face was stained with tears, and when she walked into the room, she sort of was heavy and stumbling, like she was maybe on drugs, or maybe drunk, or maybe on heavy medication, and she sort of stumbled into the room and then introduced herself as Natalie Perrier. So Mazarin had actually earlier called on her to come in and speak to him, both to verify her husband's story about what happened, the robbery, the affair, and also to see what else she might know about Lionel. And also, since she clearly was involved in this whole potential love triangle here, he had to also consider her as a potential suspect in whatever happened to Lionel. So he gestured for Natalie to take a seat, and then once she had, he asked her to tell him all about how she had met Lionel. Natalie, at this point, really clearly could not sort of keep herself together. She kept apologizing and kept explaining that she was on prescription medication that made it really hard for her to keep a grip on her emotions, and this whole situation had really rattled her. But eventually, after this sort of setup about how sorry she is and what a mess she is, she eventually tells Mazarin that she had met Lionel at a nightclub and that, yes, they had hooked up a few times, but since the last time they hadn't seen each other, and it had been quite a while, like it was nothing. When Mazarin asked her about the robbery, she said that Lionel had told her about having serious gambling debts from playing poker, and so because of that, she had just sort of naturally suspected that he must have robbed them. She also added that, just to be clear, her and Philippe were both at their home all night on the evening that Lionel disappeared, and that if Philippe had gone to confront Lionel at any point, she did not know anything about it. And so at this point, Mazarin sat back in his chair and just considered what he was seeing and what he was hearing. Natalie seemed genuinely devastated by this whole situation. To Mazarin, it seemed like she was believable, that she was coming in here telling the truth. And so he really doubted that she directly had anything to do with Lionel's disappearance. However, while Natalie's emotional state certainly made her seem less likely as a suspect, Mazarin wondered if maybe her tears were a clue. By her own account, she'd only had a fleeting relationship with Lionel, not some, passionate relationship or something. So maybe the reason she's this upset is because she actually knows that her husband was involved in what happened to Lionel. A few days later, Captain Mazarin walked through a wooded rural area near the coast, 220 miles away from Chambéry. An officer from the Marseille police was walking a few steps ahead of him. This officer had called Mazarin yesterday to tell him that a body had been discovered in these woods just after dawn on April 30th, so less than 10 hours after Lionel was last seen by his family. And after running the body's fingerprints through the database, they had identified the victim. It was Lionel. And Mazarin was baffled by this. Marseille was more than a 4-hour drive from Chambéry. And as far as Mazarin knew, Lionel didn't know anybody in Marseille and did not go there with any regularity. And there was just plenty of other wooded areas closer to Chambéry. So why drive all the way out here? It just didn't really make any sense. And so Mazarin continued following this officer, and at some point, they stepped into this small clearing, and Mazarin saw there was a pile of burnt logs and branches sort of lying in the grass right in the middle, and the other officer said that this was the spot where Lionel was found. And then the officer pulled out a folder that had photos of Lionel's body. And so Mazarin was being brought here just to see exactly where it had been found. And so Mazarin looked down at the photo, and what he saw was, in this spot that he was standing near, there was this smoldering bonfire. It was clearly out, but there was still smoke coming off of it. And then in the middle of all these logs was clearly a charred corpse. The officer that brought him here explained that the medical examiner had found a gunshot wound in the back of Lionel's head. So it did appear that he was actually killed before he was set on fire. And so as Mazarin was taking all this new information in, everything just started to make sense. So this was exactly how drug trafficking gangs in France typically disposed of bodies. The police even had a name for it. They called it a barbecue. The gangs would shoot their victims in the head and then burn their bodies over a bonfire to make them harder to identify. Mazarin had assumed that Lionel's murder was a revenge killing. But now it actually looked more likely that this could have been a gang execution. None of Lionel's family or friends had ever mentioned that he was involved with a gang in any way, but Mazarin knew that Lionel worked in nightclubs and had a history of breaking up fights, so it was definitely possible that he might have crossed paths with the wrong person. Also, there was the fact that apparently Lionel had these huge debts from gambling. There's just sort of a seedy underworld that potentially he was around that could have led to him being killed this way. Also, if this was gang-related, it would sort of explain why he was all the way out here in Marseille, because Marseille was a city that historically had a lot of issues with drug trafficking and gangs. And so Mazarin realized he could have been wrong about this case basically from the start. Maybe Mike and Philippe actually had nothing to do with it at all. Around 10 p.m. on May 5th, 2012, about 100 miles from the spot where Lionel's body was found, Captain Florent Mazarin pulled into the parking lot of a gas station. He got out, he walked inside, and told the clerk that he needed to look at the security camera footage. So during the 4-hour drive from Marseille back to Chambéry, so after Mazarin had gone out and seen where Lionel had been found during that ride home, he had been going back and forth between his first two suspects, Mike and Philippe, and this new theory that a gang had killed Lionel. And so he wasn't really sure how he was going to navigate, like what to do here with running these two sort of simultaneous investigations. But as he's driving, as he's on his way back home, he realizes there might actually be a way to prove whether or not either Mike or Philippe were involved in this killing. There were only two roads that connected Chambéry to Marseille. And so Lionel's killer or killers must have driven down one of them at some point during the night of April 29th. So Mazarin had been checking the cameras at every toll booth and every gas station that he passed on his drive to see if any of them had captured a glimpse of Lionel. So far, he'd just been disappointed because most of the cameras didn't even work, or the footage had already been erased or written over. And so now, as he followed this clerk into the back room and was shown to their computer to go ahead and look at the footage, Mazarin was expecting that this stop would be the same as all the others, a big disappointment. However, as soon as they fired up the computer, right away Mazarin saw that they did have footage, and the footage did cover the time period he was looking for. However, when he began scanning the footage around the date of April 29th, April 30th, at first nothing stood out. However, when he reached the early hours of April 30th, where he would normally stop and say, okay, I didn't see anything, it is what it is, for whatever reason, he decided to just keep on scanning the footage, just keep on watching more of April 30th. And eventually, he did see something of interest. At 5:43 a.m. on April 30th, a black Volkswagen vehicle pulls into frame, and it actually parks in the gas station parking lot. And this car, its license plate ended in 73, which meant this car was registered in Chambéry. He's watching this car, comes into the lot, it parks, and the driver gets out. And right away, Mazarin pauses the video and he zooms in on the driver's face, but the video was just too grainy. He couldn't tell who the driver was. But then something in the passenger seat of this car catches his attention. And so he zoomed in on the passenger seat, and when he realized what he was looking at, his stomach just dropped.
That's crazy, bro.
Based on that video, forensic evidence, and interviews with witnesses, this is what police believe happened to Lionel Veronese on April 29th, 2012. Around 10:15 p.m., the killer sat in the back seat of a car as it drove through the streets of Chambéry with a gun resting on the seat next to them. Now, the killer had told the driver that they were not planning to use the gun tonight, it was just there for intimidation. However, the killer's emotions were really running high, and they honestly weren't even sure what they were going to do when they saw Lionel. And so the car kept on driving along until eventually it came to a stop outside of an apartment building, and then a few seconds later, the passenger side front door opened up, and Lionel climbed inside the car. As the driver put the car back into gear and started driving down the road, the killer from the back seat confronted Lionel about something that had really been bothering them. And it gradually turned into a very heated argument. And then, at some point, the killer raised that gun they weren't going to use, aimed at the back of Lionel's head, and fired. The driver immediately whipped around and looked at the killer and just stared at them. They seemed completely shocked by this crazy sudden escalation here, but they didn't stop driving. Instead, they stepped on the gas and sped down the road until they reached a house. And then the killer and the driver both went inside of that house and they formulated a plan for what would happen next. So the plan was the driver, along with another accomplice who was in the house they went to, would drive down to Marseille, they would find a secluded spot out in the woods, they'd make a bonfire, and they would burn Lionel's body. That's how they dispose of it. And then on the way back, their plan was to toss all the evidence into the river. As for the killer, the one who actually pulled the trigger, they were going to stay at this house. They were not going to leave. The driver and the other accomplice agreed that the killer had already caused enough trouble for one night. So the killer just went upstairs into their bedroom, they slipped on a robe, and they watched from the window as the other two got into the car and drove off. The killer was Philippe's wife, Natalie Perrier, the woman Lionel had had an affair with. To Lionel, their affair had been meaningless, just a fling. But for Natalie, she wanted more. She'd gotten bored of her quiet life as a luxurious housewife in the suburbs. and she'd quickly fallen in love with Lionel and the seemingly very exciting life that he lived. And so when Lionel stopped paying attention to her, she'd gotten so mad that she took revenge. She went with Mike to pick up Lionel on the night he was killed so that she could confront him. But moments after Lionel got in the car, her emotions got the best of her, and she shot and killed him. And this was definitely not the plan that Mike had agreed to. Like, he and her had discussed what was going to happen. It didn't include murdering Lionel. But after the murder, Mike didn't say, I'm going to go to the police. Instead, he and Natalie went to her husband, Philippe, for help. And Philippe agreed to dispose of Lionel's body and cover up the crime. On the security footage from the gas station, what Mazarin saw in the passenger seat of that black Volkswagen was Philippe. He was sitting there, just right in the passenger seat. And it would turn out the driver of the car was Mike. Natalie was ultimately convicted of Lionel's murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Mike was sentenced to 6 years for kidnapping and destroying evidence, and Philippe was sentenced to 3 years for helping get rid of Lionel's body. He and Natalie are now divorced, and also as for that robbery that played seemingly a central role in the story at the beginning, we actually don't know if the robbery ever occurred or if it was simply a fabrication.
Damn.
When he said it was the wife, and that's nothing. And it happened in what, 2012?
Yeah. Everybody else has already did their time and they're out. Man. But keep going.
I didn't process. When he said it was Natalie, my brain didn't process because I had already made up in my mind what it was. So my brain didn't process. And so after the fact, after he said it, I was like, wait.
A small percentage of my mind went to the fact that she could have had some doings with his murder, but I didn't want to commit to it. It was a small inkling.
Because I'm like, what would be the reason? But then when he kept mentioning that they had some type of encounter and stuff like that, and she was like,
he said it just happened once. It was
she was like a few times,
and she was like, nah,
and she wanted more.
Wow, bro, you're married, unless that's a thing that they do where they just like, yeah, we take turns going back and I let her do hers, I do me.
It don't seem like it, unless they had an understanding, but wow. Well, he probably didn't. I was about to say, I wonder did he see her when he got in the car? Like, in the back seat? Or it probably was like, by the time he got in, they drove off, it's like too late now, because he in the, you know what I'm saying? Like, he in the car. Like, that's so effed up.
And they gonna hold you, bro.
And he trusted Michael. Mike, you supposed to be his friend.
Mike, anytime somebody's sitting in the back seat behind the individual, and you like, what you got a gun for? Know that they plan on killing him. What you said? Like, it's just common sense, bro. They're gonna kill him. You talking about, I didn't think she was gonna use the gun. She told me that's a lie. You knew she was gonna pull that trigger. You don't just bring a gun
because I want to have a conversation with them. No,
not at all, man.
And I'll be like, what you want to have a conversation with him for?
What you said?
Like, that's so crazy.
That's some straight bull, bro. I don't care what nobody got to say, bro. That's in peace,
because that is so effed up.
So effed up, bro.
And he just thinking he going out with a friend, and the whole time you up helping.
Shout out to him for even telling Julian about the whole situation to even lead them in that direction, even though they didn't have hard proof, but it gave them an opportunity to lead, opportunity to.
Gave them a good lead.
I'm tired. Sorry, I got no sleep, but gave them a direction to go into. Because without that, I don't think they. What you think?
Yeah, I think without actually having Michael name and being able to then piece other things together, I don't think they would have really had much at all, because keep in mind he works at a club. Like he stated, they would have been probably on the gambling thing and then trying to go down that direction and trying to see who he owed money to or something like that. And it I feel like it would have took a long time.
Yep.
Because you would have had,
because you would have been like, Mike, and why Mike even try to lie and say I was with my girl?
Michael, what, you think she was just gonna lie for you? Ain't lie for you, Chad. Don't get me up in no mess. Don't put me in your mess. But I do think eventually they would have probably pieced things together because his body was found pretty early. And so then you just kind of trace steps back from there. So
true.
But other than that, that is effed up.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Y'all spam us up, man. Let us know y'all thoughts about it for us in the comment section down below, man. But until next time, y'all know how it go, man. I do go by the name DJ New Kid. That's it.
See you, Nicole.
We are.
Kid and C.
We are.
Go and get it, ain't no time to kick it. Got a stack of flip for my folks. Dollar, 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 dollar. Please tell me you can hear me. Don't turn your back and don't neglect me. Just let me know if you need me. Dollar, 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 dollar. Let me watch out for my partners. Keep my money long, get my team strong. Let me run away from my problems.